All right. We're going to start off today talking about three things that are going to help us understand the piece of the Bible that we're looking at in a couple of minutes. The first thing is fish. All right. I asked you earlier, how do you feel about fish? What's your relationship with fish? So this guy right here, this is not a fish. I realize this is an orca, but he's kind of like a fish, right? And so this one actually, I don't remember his name, Bernardo, I think. And we have some interns who are hanging out for the summer, and Bernardo is their mascot right now. I don't know if he's an official mascot or this is just something they're playing around with, but here's the image. Here's the first thing, fish. So how do you feel about fish? All right, I'll tell you a story about me and fish. I love to eat salmon. Yeah, I love it a lot. And we actually made a tradition out of this when our kids were little, is that we would get fish every Friday. We called it Fishy Fridays. We'd get salmon and we eat it with rice and some dill mayonnaise. Delicious. My kids now, if we say we're going to have fish and rice, we don't do the Friday thing anymore. But if we say we're going to have fish and rice, they still get so excited. But of course, having fish all the time, it's super healthy. And that's why I started doing it, right? Fish are really good for you. But the problem is fish, especially salmon, is kind of expensive. And so one year I actually bought a bunch of fish right off the boat because it was cheaper that way and filleted them in my own backyard with one of my sons. Fantastic experience, but man, bees really like fresh fish. And so I got stung probably 20 times while I was filleting salmon in my backyard. So good memories, but I don't know how many times I'm gonna do that again. So think about what your story is so you can remember this big idea, fish. Fish, that's the first one. Today, next big idea is a boat. All right, what do you think about that? There's a sailboat for you. This is one of those little one-person sailboats. And if you were down at the beach today, you got to see some of these boats out there. They're down there all the time at Blackie Spit. And this kind of boat, I actually spent some time in one of these boats when I was a kid. I spent a whole summer when I was, I think, maybe 10 years old, learning how to sail one of these boats. I have not sailed since, but it was super fun. All right, so a boat. So what does this mean to me? I guess my big memories of a boat are, it's just so different out on the water. Especially when you're not used to it and you get out into that environment and you're being thrown around by the wind. Oh man, you feel out of control. You feel like you don't understand what's going on. It's very exciting. It's very amazing. It's one of the most beautiful things you can do. It's refreshing, but it's also a little bit out of control. It's unusual, out of the ordinary. Third big idea is a mountain. All right, check that out. So this is a mountain. Now, the mountain we're going to be talking about later is not a mountain like we would think of a mountain, like huge with snow on the top. It's a mountain in the Bible, which is usually in Israel. In this case, it is. And most of these are more like what we would call big hills. Now, does anybody know what mountain this is or what big hill this is? So this is the Chief. This is a Staubamus Chief in Squamish, and this is the view from the top. And look at that. That is amazing. That is amazing. So what big ideas could we take away about mountains? Well, one is that we could take away, it's kind of overwhelming and glorious, right? Another one that we could take away is perspective. Mountains put life in perspective, don't they? Like we think everything, one of these little houses down here, you can't really see many houses, but one tiny building from this view is where much of our life and energy and all the things we do are focused. That seems like the whole world when you're in your house or your office. But when you get up on top of the mountain, you see the view, you see perspective. Okay, that's just one small part of a much larger world. A world that, in fact, is full of glory and beauty. Wow, okay, so that's the third big idea, mountains. All right, so keep those in your mind. The big ideas for today are fish, boats, and mountains. So I'm going to start out with the big point for today. We're going to have 2 points in the message today, but the big one, the one that we're going to say over and over is this: there is no one else like Jesus. Maybe you've known Jesus for a long time. Maybe you've been trying to follow him your whole life. Maybe you don't really know much about him and this is your first introduction. There is no one else in all of history who's like Jesus. Now, I'm not just saying that because of what I believe or what the Bible says is true. I'm saying it because it's a fact. There really is no other person, no other human being who is anything like what we find in the historical figure of Jesus. So why would I say that Jesus is unique? Why is it that there's no one else like the historical Jesus? Sometimes people compare Jesus to a bunch of different people. They compare him to other religious founders. So maybe thinking about Muhammad or Buddha, right? Sometimes people compare Jesus to great philosophers like Socrates or Descartes or Plato or Aristotle, people who founded these systems of thought. And Jesus did, for sure, he brought teaching into the world that dramatically changed history. And so did these other people. Although I would argue that Jesus changed it much more. But Jesus did something that none of these other people did. Each of these religious founders or philosophers or great thinkers, they brought in primarily their goal was to bring in a set of teaching, a set of rules for how to live life, which is not at all what Jesus did. He doesn't bring us a set of rules. In fact, he came and did away with many of the rules that were there before him. It doesn't mean rules have no place, but the main message that Jesus brings into the world has nothing to do with rules. Second thing, his teaching wasn't even his main point. Unlike all the rest of those guys who came and they brought their teaching, they were going to show people how to live, and that was the main thing that they were there to do. Jesus actually came primarily with a mission. His mission, he didn't come just to teach people. He brought his teaching, but he came to do something. He came to accomplish something. And that thing that he came to do, we'll talk about it again later, but that thing he came to do was actually to die on a cross. Another way that Jesus is different from all those other religious founders and thinkers is that almost all of them envision the world like a circle. Whether they said it clearly or not, they envision things as just going on kind of the way they always have. Some of them founded their religions on that, like Buddha. Others just assumed it in the way that they taught, like Plato or Aristotle. This is how the world is, and this is how it's always going to be, and so we need to deal with it in a certain way. But Jesus, in his teaching, his understanding of the world was nothing like a circle. In fact, the truth that he brought into the world is that the world was much more like an arrow than it is like a circle. History is not a circle that goes on forever. It's an arrow, and it's going somewhere. Now, looking back, we can see that especially since the time of Jesus, that has been true. We might argue about where is all of this going, but it is certainly going somewhere. Things are not the same as they used to be. And finally, Jesus made a very large claim that none of these other thinkers or religious founders even came close to making. In fact, all of these other guys this had been the last thing that they would have ever done. Jesus claimed to be God. He didn't just claim to be some very special person who God had chosen, although he certainly was that as well, the Son of God. He claimed to be God himself. Later on in the fall, we're going to go through some of the reasons we know that he claimed that. But just think about that claim for a moment. That is not a normal thing for people to claim. It's especially not a normal thing for people to claim who are mentally competent. Now, there are a few people in the world and in history who have claimed things like that. But even the greatest, people like Alexander the Great, who claimed to be a god, he was not making the same kind of claim that Jesus made. He was claiming to be one of the Greek gods, which were really actually not all that powerful when you think about it, when you compare them to the Christian idea of God. Jesus was claiming to be the God that the Jewish people had always worshipped. the one God who created the entire universe, the God who has all power, the God who is beyond time. That's who he claimed to be. Now, maybe you could find a few people in the world today who make that claim, but those people are not mentally competent. Those people are mentally ill in severe ways. But we know Jesus does not strike anyone as a mentally incompetent or mentally ill person. Mentally ill people don't change the course of history. They don't end up with millions, billions of people following after them, trying to become more like them. So what do you do with a guy who makes a claim like that, but who is obviously very wise? The Jesus that we encounter in the pages of the Bible is wiser than anyone that we've ever met. He is full of truth. He's full of grace. He's full of love for the people around him. He's full of power. He makes extraordinary claims. He tells us very different things than any other thinker or religious founder had ever even come up with. He was on a mission in the world, a mission actually to save the world, and to make it even weirder, the way that he's going to save the whole world. His great mission, he was going to die. He was going to die in order to save the whole world. And he did it. Jesus is not like any other human being. He is unique in all of history. And that means we should at least know something about him. We should at least, at some point in our lives, have looked carefully into who he is and what do I do with a person like that. The part of the Bible that we're looking at today is from a book of the Bible called 2 Peter and chapter 1. And this is actually a letter that was written by a guy named Peter, who was one of Jesus's closest friends when Jesus was on earth. And now, so that had been back when Peter was in his 30s, maybe up to 40. And now it's the end of Peter's life. This is maybe 30 years later. He has followed Jesus for a long time. He has learned many things. And now he's writing a letter to all of us saying, okay, I'm about to leave the world, and here's what's really important. Here's what happened to me. And here's how it changed me. And here's what you need to know about this man, Jesus. So we're going to read, and we're going to use those three stories, those three images that we talked about earlier, a fish, a boat, and a mountain. We're going to use those three images, and we're going to tell three stories from Peter's life. Three different things that happened between him and Jesus when Jesus was on earth. All right, so let's start out, and we are reading here from 2 Peter chapter 1, and starting at verse 12. Peter says, "So I will always remind you of these things." Okay, so he's talking here about all the things that happened when Jesus was around. "Even though you know them and are firmly established in the truth that you now have. I think it is right to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body. Because I know that I will soon put it aside, as our Lord Jesus has made clear to me. And I will make every effort to see that after my departure, so after he dies, you will always be able to remember these things. For we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." All right, so what's Peter telling us here? This is kind of the intro to what he's about to say. What he's telling us here is this: whether or not you've heard these stories before. So some of you, the stories I'm about to tell, some of you will never have heard these stories. 3 stories from Peter's life, times that he was with Jesus. But some of you will have heard these stories over and over again. When Peter, who had lived with Jesus himself, got to the end of his life, and he's looking back and he's saying, what should I do right now? What's the best thing I could give to these people who I've been telling these people about Jesus for 30 years? What's the best thing that I could do for them right now? And here's what he comes up with. The best thing that I could do for them is to tell them one more time. He's going to tell us the stories again because it is extremely important for us to remember them and take them in deeply and start to live in a different way because of them. That's the whole point of Jesus coming and the whole point of these stories. So whether you've never heard these stories before or whether you've heard them 1,000 times, you need to sit up and pay attention because these stories are powerful and they can bless your life if you'll allow them to. All right, so first story. This story, we're going to bring back our image of the fish. All right, so what was your relationship with fish? Well, here's a story that happened to Peter. So Peter just been living his life like most of us do. And you know, Peter wasn't actually a crazy man. He wasn't an extreme. He wasn't a radical, nothing like that. Peter was, for most of his life, growing up in his early adulthood, even into middle age, Peter was a very regular guy. Now, he ended up becoming the first bishop of Rome and the best friend of Jesus who changed the history of the world, but he didn't start out that way. He was just a regular guy. In fact, he grew up, small town, he found a job, he went to school, trained under someone, became a fisherman. Okay, so here's why Peter's connected with fish. His relationship with fish was extensive. So every night, this was his job to go out and fish. Not only that, so he got a regular job. This was an upstanding job in his society. So very similar to lots of jobs in our society, right? I mean, I know he's doing a different thing. Most of us don't throw nets into the water to catch fish for a living. Maybe a couple of people. But Peter, this is what people did in his society. This was very normal. So you can think of this job like being a teacher or being an accountant or being a doctor or working at a restaurant. Any kind of normal occupation, that's the kind of spot Peter had in his society. All right, so he's doing that. He also got married. This was totally normal. This is what every young man wanted. He got married and he had some kids. We don't know how many kids. And he had a house. And he even had, his mother-in-law was living with him, maybe some other relatives. So he even had enough space for that, right? So he was doing okay. He had all the things that his society told him he should have. He had a normal life. And here's the thing, it wasn't enough. Peter had a nagging feeling on the inside that even though he had all the things that his society said, this is what you should have, this is the kind of, once you get this, you've got it. That's what life is. Even though he had all that, it wasn't enough. He had a nagging feeling on the inside that there had to be more, that he was called to more. And so that's going to be our second point for today. We've only got 2 points. We're going to bring them back up a couple of times. But our second point is this: normal life is not enough. Normal life is not enough. What do I mean? Oh, we should be greedy and just having a regular amount of money isn't enough. No, what I mean is this: you were made for more. You were made for a much greater purpose than just those normal things that our society says, go do this. You were made for a greater purpose than entertainment. You were made for a greater purpose than your career. You were made for a greater purpose than shopping at the mall or on the internet. You were made for a greater purpose than sharing memes on Facebook. You were made for a greater purpose than video games. You were made for a greater purpose than your family. Now, I know that might sound crazy. I'm not saying that any of those things are bad. They are not. Those are all good things, and you were made for a greater purpose than all of them. Now, what is that purpose? We'll get to that. But you were made for a greater purpose. And Peter knew that deep down. And here's the thing. When he ran into this guy, Jesus, which he did several times before he decided to follow him and give his whole life up to follow this guy, Jesus, when he ran into Jesus, he felt it deeply. Whenever he was around Jesus, he felt that his life was not enough. Normal life is not enough. And so the story with fish, it goes like this. One day he'd been out fishing all night, working at his very normal job, and he had caught nothing. He's discouraged, frustrated, annoyed, depressed, maybe having a lot of negative thoughts about his life and just things that are going on. Have you ever felt like that? Yeah. He was feeling already in that moment like normal life was not enough. He brought his boat into the shore, and it was the morning time because he'd been fishing all night with his friends, with his partners, and Jesus was standing on the shore when he got there. And Jesus looked him in the eye and he said, "Peter, cast your net, throw your net over the right side of the boat." And this command from Jesus made zero sense. There were no fish there. He knew that. He'd already fished in the good spots all night. Yet, because Jesus told him to do it, he did it. He threw his net over the right side of the boat, and hundreds of fish filled the net. Now, what did Jesus communicate to him in that moment? There's more. There's more to life than just this normal life that you're living. And what is the more? Here's what Jesus was saying. It is me. It's Jesus himself. Peter immediately, he got out of the boat, he fell down on the ground in front of Jesus, and he said, "Go away from me, Lord, because I am a sinful person. I am deeply broken. Something's wrong inside of me, and I know it. And you are beyond anything or anyone that I've ever met. I shouldn't even be in your presence. Whenever I'm in your presence, I feel way worse. I feel like I am not enough." And Jesus looked at him and loved him and said, "Peter, stand up and come follow me. I'm going to change your whole life. I'm going to show you what that purpose that you were made for really is." And so that's what we're going to remember with the fish, the image of the fish. Normal life is not enough. All right, so after the fish, Peter gave up his whole life like it didn't even mean anything to him, even though there were lots of good things there, and he followed after Jesus. So what did Peter find? All right, so second image, remember our picture? Second picture is the boat, sailboat. So for this, we're going to think about a second story from Peter's life. And in this story, Peter and his friends are on a boat. They've been traveling around by boat with Jesus. They've gone a number of places this way. And Jesus had just been teaching to huge crowds of people and had just done miracles in front of people. Actually, at this point, they had seen Jesus do many, many miracles. One of them was feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread. And then Jesus said, "Hey, you know what? I need some time by myself. You guys, it's just too much. So you guys get in your boat and go across the lake, a very large lake. Can't see the other side. Go across the lake to the other side. I'm going to meet you over there." And they're like, "Okay, I guess we'll see you in a few days." So they get in their boats. They start heading out into the lake. Jesus goes up on top of a hill and he starts to pray. No one was with him. Now, in the middle of the night, remember they did a lot of stuff at night, these guys. So the middle of the night, around midnight actually, in the middle of this lake, Peter and his friends are out. They're trying to row across the lake and a storm whips up. And the storm gets worse and worse and actually gets to the point where they are very concerned that the boat is going to sink. They're bailing water out of the boat. They're running all up and down trying to make sure that the boat stays as steady as possible. They are fighting for their lives in the darkness. And then all of a sudden, imagine the feeling in that situation. Remember we said earlier that being out on the water is kind of wild and chaotic, right? Well, imagine the feeling in that situation. You're terrified, you're running, you're striving, you're stressed to the max, and you can't see very far. There's rain pelting you, there's wind going on. All of a sudden you see something out of the corner of your eye, like something that's happening out there in the water that's not just the waves. What is it? Then you see it again, but it goes in and out. You scream maybe, you yell, "What is that?" At first they think what they're seeing is a ghost, because it kind of looks like a human being out in the water. Turns out it's actually Jesus walking to them through the middle of the storm. Now, I know this is a famous story, so probably most of us have heard of this before, Jesus walking on the water, but try to suspend that for a minute, the fact that you've heard about this before, and think about what Peter is saying here. He's saying we were eyewitnesses of this. We saw this with our own eyes. This is not a myth that was made up. It's not a legend. It's not a metaphor. We saw this guy who we knew walking on top of the water in the middle of a storm, and the storm couldn't touch him. How would you react in that moment? I think they stopped fighting for their lives, at least for a minute. Jesus comes and gets in the boat, and he turns around to the water, the wind and the waves, and he rebukes them. He says, "Be quiet, silence." I don't know if he yelled it or if he just whispered it. And immediately, the weather responds to his command. Now remember, Peter is saying this is not a legend or a metaphor. This is what he saw with his own eyes. What does Peter feel in that moment? Peter does not know what to do. In fact, what he and his friends do is they look at each other, probably with their mouths wide open, and they say, "What kind of a man is this?" We've known for a while that he was powerful, that he was a prophet, but what kind of person is this? What kind of human being can walk on top of water and then speak to the wind and the waves, and the wind and the waves immediately listen? What those guys end up doing in that moment, I think before they even realize what they're doing, is they end up worshiping Jesus. They end up on their knees saying things like, "You are greater than anyone we've ever known. Blessed are you, hallelujah." And Jesus doesn't stop them. Remember we said earlier that he claimed to be God? All of these men had grown up knowing that it was the worst thing you could do to worship anyone who was not God, anything other than God. Yet all 12 of these men fall down on their knees in this boat in the middle of the lake and worship this man, because there was no other way they could respond to what they saw. There is no one else like Jesus. Third story, third image. Remember our image of the mountain. Yeah, Stawamus Chief. Remember we said this was glory and perspective on life. Glory and perspective. All right, so story from Peter and Jesus about a mountain. So here we're going to go back to 2 Peter chapter 1, and here's the rest of what Peter says. We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty, his greatness. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. All right, what in the world is going on here? What is Peter trying to tell us? Well, this is a story. The people he's writing to knew the story. It's a story of something that happened in Peter's life when he was living with Jesus. So remember in the last story, the boat, Jesus had gone up on a mountainside to pray by himself. Well, in this story, Jesus takes some of his friends, his disciples, he takes them with him. Now, the ones that he decides to take are Peter and James and John, who seem to have been Jesus' three closest friends. And he says to these guys, "Okay, guys, leave everybody else here. The three of us, the four of us, let's go up on this hill, this mountain that's here, and we're going to spend the night in prayer." So they're all excited. They're like, "Yes, okay, Jesus is finally taking us to pray with him." Okay, so they go up the mountain, they start praying. And this is a marathon prayer session. I mean, the first thing that these guys find is that there is no way they can keep up with Jesus. He seems to just love praying. Have you ever tried praying before? Now, Don't get me wrong, praying is one of the greatest things that a human being can do, but it takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of experience. It takes the power of God, actually, to help us become used to it and good at it. It's not exactly a natural thing for most people. But Jesus, it seems to be like his home, like the place where he lives. He's praying and he doesn't stop. I don't know if that means he's talking the whole time. Probably not. Probably much of that time he's in silence. He's listening to God, his Father. He's saying things back to him. He's asking for different people. Jesus is enthralled by this. It fills him with life and power. And during this time, what do we see? These 3 disciples that he's brought with him, it fills them with exhaustion. They cannot keep up. They could pray maybe for half an hour or an hour, but man, that's a long time. And Jesus keeps going all night long. And so what happens to these 3 guys? They fall sound asleep. And then something wakes them up. And what wakes them up, they will never forget. It's actually quite hard, I think, for them to fully describe to us what wakes them up. Peter, in this passage that we just read, he calls it the majestic glory. So we had that picture of the mountain and we said that view from the mountain is glorious, right? The sunshine, the sound, the trees. Oh, it's amazing. It fills us. It almost overwhelms us with its greatness. And here Peter says that when he woke up on that hillside with Jesus, what he saw he can only describe as the majestic glory. Majestic means exceedingly great. The exceedingly great glory. It's almost like Peter is saying, what I saw was the awesomeness. It was the greatest thing that I've ever experienced in my life. And what it was the face of his friend Jesus. Only his face had somehow been transformed. He looked different. There was a feel about the place. Jesus was shining. He was shining so bright, it was almost like the sun. It was like looking into the sun. Actually, Peter thought it was even brighter than the sun. It was whiter than white. It was something indescribable. And there were people with Jesus, actually people who had been dead for a long time, but who apparently were alive right in that moment talking with him. Jesus, somehow in that moment, what is happening is as Jesus is praying with his Father in heaven, the kind of veil or curtain that covers the spiritual world, that we can't really see what's going on outside of our physical world in any normal life. That veil was removed. Heaven was opened and you could see it for a moment. Now it's always there, but it was open in this moment. And when it was open, Peter and his friends were absolutely overwhelmed. They fell down in front of Jesus. They blabbered out a bunch of nonsense. They didn't even know what to say. And God immediately brought down a kind of fog or a mist so that they couldn't see it anymore. Because even the vision of this threatened to destroy them. It's kind of like looking at the sun, how the sun can burn your eyes. They weren't ready yet for this. It was too good for them to fully experience it or to experience it for very long. And then, all of a sudden, boom, things went back to normal life. The heaven had been opened. They'd seen this incredible vision that they remembered for the rest of their lives that changed them at a deep level. And then, boom, things were back to normal, just regular Jesus standing in front of them. And he said, hey, don't tell anybody what you just saw. Not yet. Wait for a while. Wait until after I've finished my mission. Then tell everybody. And that's exactly what Peter is doing here. He waited until Jesus' mission was done, and then he went to tell everybody.